on to more color exercises. We are going to do some blending techniques. So you're going to need the same materials. I'm flashing you down now. Here we go. You need your sketchbook. You need your palette. I have a bunch of colors on here already. The bottom of your palette, little water squirt bottle, brush cleaner that you're using. And this time I'm going to show you how to clean up your palette a little bit more when you're done. And don't forget you need some paper towels to clean your brushes regularly. We are going to learn 3 different blending techniques. One called the wet technique, one called dry brush, and one called impasto. So on 3 pages in your sketchbook, you'll draw a circle. Now, Mr. Lin has this great trick for drawing circles. I'm not very good at it, but what he can do is he holds his paper and he twirls it around. I'll have him show you sometime, but I do have a little bit of a trick for drawing a circle. I want your circle on your sketchbook to be about this size. You can see it's about as big as the palm of my hand. When you make a circle, this doesn't have to be perfect, but I just wanted to show you a drawing trick. You keep your hand on the inside of the circle. It acts like a compass. I can flip my page around. It's a better circle. It's weird. If you don't do that, one side of your circle always looks better than the other. Here, I'll show you. Like if I do it just sitting here and I draw this side of the circle, looks pretty good. But if I don't turn my paper and I try to draw this side, it's harder because my hand is acting like a compass when I keep it on the inside of the circle. Draw a circle about that big. Again, this is blending techniques. Blending techniques. And we are practicing with a sphere and pretending like it has a light source. So this is my light. I'm pretending like this is my light coming from over here. So I drew in a little bit of shadow, not too much. And we'll do the wet blending technique first. To do these exercises, pick 2 hues that you want to use, and you'll be using some tints as well. If you remember, tints are using white, so I want to make sure I still have a little bit of white in my palette. I want to put a little bit more. Notice whenever I'm putting paint out, I'm not putting very much. Look how big my finger is. It's not very much paint. So let's start with, last time we did complements with green. So I think I need a little bit of room on my palette. So I wanted to show you this trick. If I have paint left over that I can use, which I do here, I have a little bit of purple. I'm going to take my palette knife and scrape some of that purple. In fact, I'll mix it with that red. I have a lot of red left over. And put it in the bottom of my container. And right along the edge works. Then it will save, especially if I have a little glop, it'll save for later. And then let's go ahead and scrape your lid off. Oh, I've got a nice glob of yellow that I might be able to use. So I'll put that in there too. And then I need to clean off my work area. So I'll take a paper towel and wipe off my palette. And the reason I don't just go run this under water is we have traps under our sink that get filled up with water or paint and clay, and it has to be cleaned. So clean it off with a paper towel first, then run it under water so you have a nice area to work on. And you can also use the back side of your palette. And make sure it's at least dry so you don't get your colors all mixed up. I'm going to flip mine over since I'm not right next to a sink and use this side. All right, so I think I'll use blue, and I'll tell you about how we're going to use the complements a little later to practice. I'll put a little blue on my palette. And I know I have some white left my container, so I'm going to grab a little bit of that with a palette knife. We have some palette knives that you can use. Put that on my palette. And I'm going to show you how to do the wet blending. Mr. Lin has a blending video that he does the wet technique. There is a link to that on your emulation step document in Schoology. You can watch his wet blending technique. Does it very similar to me, but we all paint a little differently, so you might find it interesting. Since my light's coming from here, I'm going to start with white and put a little blob of white that might be my highlight. Now when you're doing the wet technique, you have to work a little bit fast. Clean off your brush, start with a clean brush, and I'm going to make a value, like I did with my monochromatic, a lighter blue, so I can show a blending. I want this ball to not end up with lines of value. So I'll make a nice transition of a fairly light blue. I'm going to put that around. Now that's a pretty big jump, but I'm going to show you how you can blend that with wet. So while they're both wet, take the paint off your paintbrush and grab into the white. I need a little bit more white. The trick to this kind of blending is taking the paint off your paintbrush. I might need a little bit more water too. I'll show you what happens if I don't take my paint off the paintbrush. So I'm working wet, wet to wet, continuing to take the paint off the paintbrush, and I'm losing that line between it then. Now also, let me make a lighter blue because it's always a little bit easier transition if I'm a little bit lighter. And notice how I blend, taking the paint off my brush. Now in Mr. Lin's video, he was working very wet, so it almost had a watercolor effect, and we might need to use that in our emulations or our paintings. So if I want to continue doing wet, sometimes I have to put a little more paint on for my next step. I'm going to go a little bit darker this way. Now watch how I can blend out that line, taking the paint off my brush with a rag or a paper towel and getting rid of that line and slowly blending that. So your goal here will be to blend this entire ball and make it get darker and darker like it would if there was a light source here. I will show you another demo on how to make the shadow look realistic, but in the meantime, this shows you the wet to wet technique. Let's do a little bit more so you can see. Need to lay down a little bit more wet so I have it wet enough to blend. Take the paint off my brush and blend it together. I want to show you if you don't take your paint off brush. Actually, that just showed you right there. If I keep the paint on my brush and try to blend it, it just makes dark marks up in there. And then I have to do another technique, which I'll show you in a little bit, called dry brushing. But for now, let's put a little bit more wet on there. Keep taking the paint off the brush to get that blended back in and to get rid of the line. See that right there? I just made a dark mark up in there. And we'll continue to go on around. If you want to, you can work with a little bit more paint on your brush to make it go a little bit faster. Now remember, that's probably dry up there already, so I need to grab some more of that value, put some light on there before I can blend those two lines together. That is the wet blending technique. Next, I would like to show you the dry of the wet technique. I was finishing the sphere for you, and I thought you might like to see how I do this if I work quickly using the wet technique. I needed to come back in. Oops, there's a little bit of red in there. And blend it out with a little bit of water, keeping it wet. And I was doing a little bit more of the sphere, and I wanted to show you that if my brush isn't clean, how it just changes the whole value of everything. I also wanted to show you what a sphere does when light hits it. It gets darker and darker, but if you have it on a surface, you actually get what's called reflected light. So I want you to do that in your sphere. It's reflected off the table, so it actually gets a little bit lighter up in here. It bounces back up. Go ahead and do my wet blending. Need a little bit of more water in here. Clean off my brush. A little bit more water. Clean it off and get that to blend. And I wanted to show you this reflected light that happens. I'm running out of blue. Let's put a little bit more blue in there. And get that value going for my reflected light. Using a little bit bigger brush. And then I'll put some dark back in here and blend that in. I can see where I've got some streaks, so I can bring some water back in there with the acrylic if it hasn't dried too much. See a little dark spot right there I need to fix. I could get my skinnier brush, and then I go back to my straight up dark blue and notice how I put my hand on the inside of the circle even with my brush. Put a really dark line, and I like to use these straight brushes to make a straight line. These blending straight to make a nice straight edge. And I'm going really dark under there now, right where it hits the table. It's a little bit darker, and I move my hand out of the inside of my circle so you can see I'm having issues. So I really need to turn my painting around to get that to blend nicely. Okay, now you can see I've got a little smudge there. I'm going to try to blend that in with my lighter values, so I need some wet paint. Shows my reflected light. And now I'm getting a little funky line down here, so I'll add a little bit of water, clean my brush off, see if I can get that to blend a little. That's looking pretty nice. And continuing to turn my sphere as I go around. I'm going to get a little bit lighter up here where the light's hitting. And blend that out with a little bit of water and some wet paint. The sphere's getting a little bit of a pointy look to it. And actually on this same sphere, I can show you the dry brush technique. That's one of the reasons I wanted to pick this back up. Let me finish it so you can see what I'm talking about here. Okay, so let's say, for example, I have this mess going right here, and my painting is all dry. So you see, I wanted to bring it down lighter. I didn't get it blended. It's a little bit of a mess, and I want it to look blended. Now you can see with the wet blending, it's got a nice smooth edge. The dry brush technique, you actually want to use one of our bad brushes, and we have a container of not so good brushes. And here's one right now. This is an old brush of mine from my studio. Paint's not all cleaned out. It's kind of hard, but I love having these kind of brushes around for this very technique. So the next technique, now I'm no longer showing you wet. I'm going to erase that. I'm showing you the dry brush technique for blending. So if I have this mark over here and I want to blend it, I can take my not so good brush, go ahead and mess it up, and I can take a little bit of a darker blue. So I'm going to mix up a little darker blue. It's starting to dry out, so put a little squirt of water on there. grab a little bit of blue, mix it in with my white. And now this is where I'm kind of being abusive to the brush. I don't even care if it gets up in the ferrule that much. And I need to take some of that paint off. So I'll take a little bit off with my rag. And then I actually stipple it. I bring some dark back in, and it lets some of the other values show through, but it does a nice blending. I don't know if you could really see what happened there. And let me make it more obvious. See right here where there's a line? Grab a little bit of really light value in this case and try to blend out this right here. See that line of light to dark? Grab some white. I'm going to test it to make sure I don't have too much on my brush because I want some of the other value to show through. Take a little bit off here. I'm going to even test it on my paper over here. That's pretty good. And watch how I can get rid of that line by letting the light kind of come down on top. And it does give your sphere, whatever you're painting, a little different texture. Our wet on wet was more smooth. Here we'll get some little dots. And I want to bring a little bit of dark back up in there. Now I'm going to test it over here, see if I'm too dark. And blend that out nice. It's kind of like what the Impressionists did when they let they would put little dots of color and let some of the other colors show through, and it would visually blend. That's what's happening with our dry brush. I think it gives a really nice blend. You see what's happening there? Do I have another spot I need to do it? Maybe right here. I think I'll blend in some of the dark back up in there. So see, I'm manhandling my brush. Bring some of stipple a little bit of that dark in here. Get everything to blend out nicely. Whoa, look what happened. My ferrule just came off my brush because this is one of my bad brushes I didn't take care of when I was younger. All right, I'm going to bring a little bit, stipple that line. Oops, went too light. See what happens if you go too light. It doesn't blend out anymore. That's nice. I want to show you while I have this one up before I take you to the next technique, which is impasto, a little bit about a shadow. Biggest mistake people make with shadows is they do something like this. They just say, well, a shadow is just a dark mark. And they're not. If you look at a shadow, it has all kinds of different values in there. Again, sometimes just from reflected light, but I'll go ahead and put it in. This is not how you want a shadow. Just a solid darkness. I'll show you what really happens in a shadow. First I'll put that in, and then I'll use my dry brush technique to make the shadow look like it really would. Would have a little reflected light in there. Notice I'm bringing my hand on the inside of the arc of my shadow even. Okay, so often right up next to the object, it would be really dark again. So I could go really, really dark. I already did that on the ball. So I have that really, really dark line right where it's touching each other. But then it gets a little bit lighter. It's that reflected light. So I'm gonna use my, you know what? Let's use a little bit of wet technique first while we're wet, and then we'll use you can use both techniques. We can blend it out, but we need a little bit of reflected light. And oftentimes, I'm not looking at a sphere right now. It really helps if you look at a sphere. You're trying to do a shadow and really paint what you see and not what you think you know. But there would be a little bit of light bouncing off this sphere and creating a light a light section through the middle of the shadow. I'm using the wet technique, as you can see right now, and then fix it up with my dry brush technique. So you might see this. If you had another light source besides one, there might be another strange line happening in your shadow, like this. You might have something happening like this, and then you might have a little bit more light coming in from the side. It's very rarely only one value. Okay, so I think the reflected light would be just a little bit lighter right in the middle. So now let's fix that with our dry brushing so that it looks more smooth. Take a little bit of dark blue and blend that reflected light out. There might even be a little reflected light up here. So on this sphere we have a combination of wet blending and dry brush blending. The next video I'll show you impasto blending.